Welcome to the Becoming Noble podcast. Today, I have the honor of being joined by Andy, known as A.M. Hickman on Substack, Shagbark on Twitter, who is a Catholic writer. He's a ruralist, a wanderer. He's someone that I've been following from a while. He's had this fascinating transition from being a rambling man to buying property and building community in a beautiful area of the remote Adirondacks in New York State. He's the initiator of the famous gas station girlfriend idea, for those of you who remember that fun saga from a while back. And I'm really excited to have him on. I've grown to appreciate his perspective for a few reasons. The first of which is that he's very much a you can just do things guy. He's actually moved out to a place, bought inexpensive property, which is an idea that you hear thrown around, and he's done it. He's living traditionally. I think he's also a very effective skeptic of people's assumptions about the necessity of all the trappings of modern mass man. And this is probably something that I get caught up in myself. He's very good at cutting away all the things that are holding people back from making a radical departure from bug life, from mainstream status concerns to creature comforts. And he's a legitimately different voice. He's authentic. He's rugged, dare I say, and he's grounded. So Andy, thank you so much for coming on, and welcome to the show.
Well, thank you, sir. I appreciate being here. I'm a big fan of what you do, and I think we both think about similar problems with a similar vocabulary, but maybe have some interesting little differences of approach. So I'm kind of interested to get into some of that with you here. I think it'd definitely be interesting. It's always interesting to compare notes.
Yeah, I'm going to be selfish today. And basically, as some of my readers and listeners know, I'm taking very seriously the idea of buying land in a remote part of Europe and starting a small polity, a town. And Andy is doing the same thing. He's a little bit further ahead in America. So I'm going to shamelessly use this time to grill him on how that's going, what his vision for the future is, and so forth. So I basically just asked him on the podcast as a pretense to get advice on my project. But you're an advocate of our guys making a bold leap and revitalizing small towns. And you've recently made this commitment to buy property and move in a remote region, in winter, no less. So I guess at a very high level, scene setting, how's that going? And what are your long-term plans? What comes next?
Well, I'll preface what I'm about to say by saying that I'm from here. I mean, I'm not from this town, but I'm from this region. So none of the way things are in this place is very foreign to me, which I think already sort of, I don't know, that gives me a lot more in the way of my odds of success, because I don't know, a lot of people from elsewhere in the U.S. and certainly in Europe would come here and they would wonder what kind of redneck, hillbilly, strange stuff. I mean, even today we walked down the whole street. It was nothing but trailer homes that were caved in from the heavy snows. Nobody lives on the street, but there is a street light. And it's all very weird. And anyway, so yeah, I spent all this time traveling around the United States, hitchhiking and stealth camping on the cheap. And I came to the conclusion that the place I'm from is pretty much the best place to be, or the best place for me to be. And I got real big into the idea of realizing that, how could I say it, is that, if your time is your money, and your monthly bills cost you a certain amount of money. Well, for most people who are wage earners, that means they're selling their time. And they're not just selling their time to sit on the porch and drink beer, although they're doing that, but they're selling their time to go to church. They're selling their time to be with their kids. They're selling their time where, they can make their wife feel special and appreciated. And so I watched work jobs, like modern jobs, just suck the life out of families and towns, and just everything sort of went to hell, except because people they needed money and they needed a job to get the money to pay the bills. But then when you look at the bills they're paying, you realize that through 99.99% of human history, the bills that they're paying would have been considered outlandish and ridiculous, or were most of them completely unheard of within living memory. So I looked at that and I said, well, couldn't I just live an 1850s era lifestyle, but with modern amendments, like I use the internet, or I might go to a dentist, or I might, ride on a public bus, or do things that are modern, but keep my expenses so low that I'm not compelled to work near as much as I would be otherwise, which in turn frees up my time to spend on my family, on my wife, on my house, on my writing, and mostly on making this community into something that's really solid. And so that was the math I was doing. And I came to the conclusion that, oh yeah, a town like this where I could buy a house for $33,000 US. I don't know what that is in pounds or in euros, but it's not much money. This makes it so that my monthly expenses are basically nothing. I know guys that live in rural Paraguay that pay more in their monthly expenses than I do, and I enjoy a higher standard of living than they do. So this seems like the perfect way to go for a lot of reasons, but the biggest one to me is control of my time. You know, I don't want to be fearing the possibility of getting laid off because I got a big mortgage and a bank loan and I got expenses and all this stuff. No, I got to make maybe $600 a month to survive. And most people can't say that.
I think, you know, with the weird caved in trailer park, it might touch on a paranoia that holds a lot of people back from this initiative, you know, pursuing a similar journey, which is that it is true, exactly as you say, that modern city life takes so much out of you. I mean, the taxes alone are just shocking. I mean, I spend more than half of what I earn in taxes. And as you say, if you put that in the context of human history, it's a completely unheard of. Yeah. On the other hand, you do get a lot of subtle, small payoffs that I think people worry they would not only lose by moving to somewhere like the town where you live, but they might actually get the opposite. They might get visible costs. You know, so in the city, this is things like the people tend, depends which area of the city, obviously, to be younger, fitter. The architecture might be, you know, again, depending on the region, might be more attractive. That's definitely not true. I mean, it's probably less true stateside. No offense. Yeah. But, and then you also get this robust sense of being around other people with a sense of purpose. And that purpose in modernity might be completely warped. It might be completely, you know, godless and misguided, but it is still like it has an energy and a dynamism to it that if you were to replace it with a town that felt dead and dying without a clear vision for how you were going to turn that around and transform it to give you the hope to push through that initial alienation, I think that concern is what gets a lot of guys stuck in a position which I don't think is viable in the long term, which is the city life. And that's what I'm trying to extricate myself from. But I get in the short term why they're hesitant to make that leap, if you see what I mean. So are you sympathetic to that? And are you thinking about how you might turn that around in your community to the extent that still exists?
You know, I'm going to give you an answer that is going to give me away as a classic American individualist and say that at the end of the day, what it comes down to is you. And the way I'd say it, and I'm not like a gym guy, right? I don't like paying money to perform useless labor for my own vanity, which I don't know. A lot of gym people, they love it. I don't get it. But the thing I'll say about this is there's a metaphor here. My cousin he likes to lift weights, or he used to, and he'd see guys wearing a weight belt around their stomach while they were doing big lifts. And he would always say how stupid it was because the little muscles, the little stabilizer muscles in your abdomen or your back don't get developed if you wear the weight belt, right? And so then when you take the weight belt off, you're not as strong as the guy who went without it, right? And I think the reason I'm saying any of this is because I think modern city living is kind of like the weight belt, right? Is when you're in that current of people who have purpose and there's money being thrown around. There's people that they seem to care about themselves. They seem to be educated, all that stuff. It's easy to just jump into the stream and kind of attain something like success. I don't know that it'd be greatness. I think it'd be success. I think that's what the city's really good at doing in its current iteration is giving people, you know, this kind of feeling of success. But when you live in a place where the majority of people are elderly, aging, moving away, lots of people are permanently unemployed, lots of people do drugs, the weather's really bad, everything is really far away, you have no reason to smile and there's no current to jump into. All you can do is strengthen yourself. And so in a sense, this place is like a psychological or a spiritual gym, where I look at all the reasons to fret and frown, and I have to just, I don't know, stick my chest out and keep going, which I think is better for me, because then I got to do it. 100% of the heavy lifting, I just got to do it, which is really hard, especially when you're alone. But I think that it produces better results on the long haul, which I guess is kind of my bet. That's what I'm betting. Maybe I'm wrong. Does that make sense?
That makes sense. Yeah. I mean, I'm thinking about the metaphor of the stabilizer muscles. One thing that's wonderful about living this in the city where I live is London. There's still a lot of really fantastic architecture and museums. And I appreciate that. I like living close to very well-crafted reminders of what my ancestors believed and achieved and built and sent forth as their legacy. But viewed from a different frame, it is faintly horrifying living in what is essentially the ossified corpse of a dead culture, because we don't build those things anymore and we don't share the value system of the people that did build them. Right. And so in this metaphor, the weight belt is the architecture, because it allows you to believe that there's still a culture there that in fact no longer exists, because the surface layer, the appearance of something is there, and you can pretend that you're attached to it in a way that you might not be in reality. And as you say, when you step outside that, you have to contend with what you are building and what you are actually living, and there's no support. I completely respect what you're saying, but on the other hand, to take a more realist stance, I think you're asking a lot of young guys when you put it in such stark terms. What I see as a possibility is that you can imagine delineations of individual who would sign up to this. You know, there are the true pioneers, right? The kind of beaver skin hunters that go out into the wilderness like yourself and lay down a flag. Oh. Then there are the kind of early adopters, you know, because I have to say, if I was in the US, I would definitely reach out to you and be like, hey, can I come visit your town? I'm very curious to see what you're doing. Right. I you know, if I was in the US, I'd probably be a curious to be an early adopter of your town. And then like following that, there are the people that probably for very understandable reasons need to move into a community, even if it's just a young community. You know, maybe they have young children, maybe they have several young children and want to be able to participate in some kind of homeschooling co-op, whatever it is. And maybe they're just not like able to convince their wives or their families, or they don't have the personal psychological disposition to be that incredibly austere frontier figure. Does that sort of like, how are you thinking about attracting, if you are, I don't know if this is presumably not the end state of your project, like you do actually want to attract a community around you. How are you thinking about like pulling those people in?
Well, where I live is not for everybody. And just for the sake of your listeners who are not familiar with what exactly I do or where I'm at, I live in a village of about 250 people in the Adirondack Park, which is larger than the largest 5 national parks in the United States put together, and is better protected wilderness land. So like just outside my window, in front of this computer I'm talking to you on, there's 120 miles of unbroken wilderness that I think only three roads go through. And I could walk that full 120 miles without encountering a single human being if I wished, other than crossing those 3 roads. So, and the nearest town of even 15,000 is more than 75 miles away. The winters are 6 months long. I had almost 2 meters of snow on my roof this winter that I had to shovel off. And when you think about that kind of thing, no, even in the best case scenario, even if this place was bumping with jobs and money and all kinds of things were going on, and we had a museum and a monastery and a school and the best public transit system in the country, most people still wouldn't want to be here, because it's just too isolated, it's too remote, and that's okay. What I want to do above all is sort of the first phase for me is finding a handful of those other pioneers. It could even be in a village this small to impact the culture here. We only need maybe 2 other families, and that's a doable goal. That's an achievable goal when there's 4 houses within walking distance from where I sit that are selling for less than $50,000 US. I mean, the value proposition is just totally obvious, right? But the second step is not necessarily to attract more and more residents. and to grow this place in population and its economy beyond what's necessary for the people who are already here, and the pioneers who came here to stay for the long haul. What the purpose of what I'm doing here is, as I see it, is making a model work that can exemplify how we can bring the heartland back to life in the United States, that people can repeat elsewhere, and they can take the core elements of it back to Nebraska or Eastern Washington or West Virginia, wherever they live, and they can roll it out. Or somebody over in Europe or somebody down in Zimbabwe, they could see the same thing and say, wait a minute, this is a model that works. Get a handful of guys together, let them sink their teeth into that place and stand by it and make things happen, to make a coherent culture, that protects both the historical good of the place, but also makes it living, so that it's not just a museum, and it's capable of self-replicating.
On this channel, it's known as Rhodesia and not Zimbabwe. This is a very
I know.
Fair. Yeah, I mean, it's funny. It's funny you should say that about the two families, because I have a young family. We're Catholic in London, the UK, and on the one hand, we're like right in the center of one of the most populous places in Europe and the world. On the other, we're incredibly isolated because we had children relatively young, and we're a religious family. And none of my friends have children. I still keep in contact with plenty of my school friends. A small percentage, probably like 1 in 8 maybe, is married now, but none have children. I'm in my 30s. So you do end up extremely isolated, to the point where even two families that we were close to in terms of proximity, had shared values with, and were unambiguously part of the same community. Because that's a big part of the problem with living in cities, is the delineations between who is and is not in your community is very, very ambiguous, right? Like, on the one hand, we're Catholic, so we attend a particular church. On the other, our kids spend a few hours at the local school, which is not Catholic. On the other, and we live in a different locality. So it's like this very, like, it's concentric circles, but it's weak concentric circles. And right. It's very easy to lose meaningful relationships in the point where you have no thick relationships, no real relationships, but you have a million weak and wavering ones. And that's exactly the opposite of what you need when you have young children. At that point, you need thick bonds. If your kids are sick, you need to be able to make a completely unreasonable request of someone like, hey, my kids are sick. I just need you guys to bring us dinner tonight because I got to look after them. I can't cook. You got to be able to make that kind of demand of someone. And you never really reach that threshold in the city. I mean, of course you can cultivate it. You can get lucky. Maybe you could move right next to a religious school. The problem being in the UK, if you're Catholic, Catholics are a minority in the UK, and English Catholics a smaller minority still. So it's slim pickings, but it's funny how, on the one hand, a project like yours could have such a remoteness and yet such closeness at the same time. Like, it doesn't follow that geographical remoteness erodes social bonds.
And in this way, I mean, in introducing me, you very understandably characterized me as a ruralist, and I might push back on that. I might modify that a little, and I might say, no, I am an urbanist, deeply. But I believe that the village is a fundamentally urban idea. I mean, it's when I see these people, a lot of people that get this idea of country living, and they get spooked by the cities, and they see how difficult it is to maintain relationships, and the crime problems, the safety problems, the expenses, and they say, oh, we got to go to the country. And what do? They go and they buy 80 acres. An hour's drive from a town that might have a church in it. And then what? Then they don't know anybody. They're lonely, and they get sick of it. And a lot of them leave. And that's the thing you don't see online as much, because it doesn't sell to say, oh yeah, I tried to be a homesteader and I couldn't do it, so now I moved back to Boston. No, you don't hear those stories as much, but I can tell you, having lived in these rural areas, yeah, it happens all the time. You can see it, right? So to me, the village is the perfect balance. It's like, I live in this village in the United States. I live in the rural United States, and I don't own an automobile, and I don't intend on purchasing one because I don't believe in automobiles. Well, what do? I walk to the store. I buy my bacon, I buy my milk and my bread, a bottle of wine if I want, and go to the library. I go to the pub. I go to church. And I just what I've listed, that's about everything that's here. But it's just about all I need. I don't need much more than that. So I'm living in a walkable, dense, urban environment of 250 people that is separated from everywhere else by primeval wilderness. That's okay. That works for me, but it is urban in this very weird way. So in a place like this, even two families, right? It's like if you and I were neighbors, right? And we had one third buddy. And it's just like, what's that article? I saw this article about 5 English guys. They've been meeting at the same pub every Thursday for 53 years or something like this, right? And they watched each other's kids grow up, right? And I think you can do that here. In fact, it's easier to do that here than it is to do it in a big city. It just actually is. If the housing is cheap and the overall value proposition that would attract residents is pretty good.
To talk practicalities for a second, how do you think about hospital and medical care? You know, especially if you've got a young family, like you can't really get away from that as a concern.
Yeah, no, you can't. I mean, of course, I'm in this. I don't know what the healthcare situation is in Britain, but I would imagine it would rate maybe a little more favorably to a person living in my position than the American system does, because the American system's worthless. So I don't know. Like my wife is 28 years old. She's never been to a doctor in her life, right? She was born in a house in a town called Freedom, Missouri. Okay. And our child that we'll have this summer will be born about 10 feet from where I'm sitting in our living room. Or is it the kitchen? I forget. I don't remember where she wants, but it's in this house, you know.
But I mean, like, sorry, I should have been more specific with my question, but is there a doctor close by, or is there like I don't know, like a midwife that lives in the town? Or
yeah, it's like 35 miles to the hospital. Although, you know, it's funny what they say. The hospital's called Alice Hyde, and they say in that town where that hospital is, there's only 3 ways to die: suicide, homicide, and Alice Hyde. So I've not heard favorable recommendations about the hospital. What I do know, though, and this is a thing that you're not going to find in Europe as much, or maybe at all, is we have Amish people here. And the Amish people have their own ways of doing things. They even have their own doctors. And for things that they don't have doctors for, they have contacts in Mexico where you could go to Mexico and pay cash for, you know, probably 1/30th the price of what you'd pay for a procedure here, and they're reputable. So and we're close with our Amish neighbors. We buy food from them. They produce a lot of food, and I think it's pretty doable stuff. The long and short of it, in the worst way, is that if you got to go to the emergency room, yeah, you're going to be in debt, or you're going to have to get on the state program. It's like welfare, except like everybody does it up here. Where they just pay your hospital bills for you. You know, you got to avoid the emergency room trips. So that's why, you know, if I'm handling axes and chainsaws, or if I'm up on a roof, I'm just extra careful, you know, because it's not worth it. I don't want to go into debt.
Yeah, I mean, in London, we don't have the Amish, but if you need a Ghanaian witch doctor, that's an advantage we definitely have. So,
wow.
You know, we have our own ways of doing things, as they say. I get one thing, you know, we were DMing a bit before this, and you said that you thought we might have different interpretations of the role of status, which is interesting. Like, I think I misunderstood when I talk about status, and it's almost certainly my own fault for poorly describing my position. But you know, when I talk about the importance of status, that initially isn't a normative declaration. Like, I'm not saying it should be important. I'm saying that it's like a fundamental of how human societies arrange themselves, like in a realist sense.
Right.
Although I do think that having social status be present in communities can be a very healthy thing. You know, for example, if someone is seen to be sacrificing themselves to the group, or, you know, working diligently and competently in the service of the group or in service of positive ideals for a long time, they should be respected and honored in their community. Like, I think at its best, social status can be a very powerful function. But also what I wasn't saying was that you should personally make the centerpiece of your life social status in the eyes of the world at large, like you shouldn't attempt celebrity in generic community. Instead, I more meant if you have embedded yourself intentionally in a community of good people, of people you respect, perhaps a religious community or something, and you're not getting respect, like you are being treated as low social status, I think it's worth asking why that is, because ideally social status, it should be about mutual respect within a group of peers. You should feel like when you've embedded yourself in a thick community that you have a special place in the world where you are held in high esteem, where people know you, where they recognize you for who you are and what you've done. So I think those dynamics are important. And I think, like, I guess one thing that people that have never lived in a town like yours, and it would be great to hear some reflections on the kind of people you live with, who the other people that live in your village are, what their characters are like, what they value, how you can connect with them, and so forth. Is, if you're someone like me from a city, the idea of moving to a small town, you're not just giving up a lot of the underpinnings of how you self understand your status, your self esteem, your networks, and so forth, and also your like identity as someone that comes from a cosmopolitan city. You're embedding yourself within a network of people that you might have nothing that it takes to impress them, to form these deep friendships, or that kind of like thick functional social interaction, status, respect might be very difficult to forge in a totally alien community. So any reflections you could offer on that would be interesting for me.
Well, it's interesting because, a lot of the things that I post, especially on Twitter, maybe more than anywhere else, that cause a lot of uproarium and controversy is anything that basically would point towards deviating from go to a top 10 metro area, make as much money as you can, climb the ladder, right? And if you can, find a way into power structures that have globally reaching consequences, right? This is how a lot of Americans conceive of status in a very, very particular way that involves mostly money, I would say, above all, and doing the things that other people with money do, whether they're rational or not, is of no import whatsoever. And a corollary to that is like projection of power, right? And so whenever I say, and I'll be cheeky about it, I'll say you should lower your standards. Like you should not care about status, and that's what I mean when I say that, because the schema for status and how it's conferred that you've just outlined is completely reasonable and, in fact, sociologically inevitable, basically anywhere, right? And yes, to seek to be on the good side of most people in your community and respected and trusted, this is obviously good. But I think in the kind of global in post-industrial era, this most natural impulse that's just baked into the human psyche has been perverted by a series of completely incoherent drives within the system. You see, where people will say the same thing where you say, oh, I want my neighbor to think I'm all right and that I could, watch his house for him when he takes a trip, to see his grandma or whatever, right? You want that. We all want that. But when that feeling is expressed in a schema of human resources moving around an economic development zone rather than citizens moving about a nation, things get really strange in ways that even self-professed conservatives would, how they think about this stuff is not entirely conservative, and it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. If maybe I'm rambling, I don't know, but it's considered low status to do what I've done and to live in a place like where I live by most Americans. But I actually think I'm better off doing this than infiltrating some big, money and power circles in the urban centers, because those systems are sort of, there's something intrinsically corrupted about them that just isn't really going to bear any fruit in the long haul.
Could you offer some vignettes of the people that you live around, that you interact with day to day? Because I think people probably have no idea like who actually lives out in a town like that, and they replace it with stereotypes of one sort or another.
Sure. Yeah, it's a strange thing here. Like the other day, we went to the little library. We have a library. It's volunteer run and only opens 2 days a week. And when we went there was a shift change between the library and volunteers. And one of the fellows that come in, he had a box on his desk. And I said, "Sir, what's in the box?" And this guy, he opened the door and he told me to put my glove on. So I put my glove on, and then he's got a burrowing owl. He has a bird. And he says, "Hold the bird." So I'm sitting there in the library and I'm holding the bird, and he proceeds to go off on this long, like hour-long litany about the life cycles of burrowing owls and how he used to have a peregrine falcon and the licensure requirements for this kind of thing, right? Like this guy he wasn't obese. He didn't smoke meth. He had a full set of teeth, and he had a lively intellect that was very interested in things. But the interests of people around here are more rooted in natural wilderness landscape stuff where guys I know a guy he traps beaver, and he does it for the town because they have problems with beaver dams. So he's obsessed with beavers, and he gets into the mind of the beaver, and it's an obsession, right? And that's what he does. That's his way of having fun. This is a little different in a way, but then yeah, you have your people too. I have a neighbor. I never see her outside of her house in regular clothes. She wears a bathrobe everywhere. That's just what she does, right? The people exist like the stereotypes, I guess, but they're not. They're different people. She's also, in spite of the fact that she hasn't painted her house in 20 some odd years or whatever, she's an avid reader. And when she heard that I write, she said, "Oh, I want to read what you write." Right? It's not stuff that an outsider would think. They would think, "Oh, this person might even be illiterate or something." No, that's not the way it is. Right? So no, it's very few caricatures really do bear out, at least in upstate New York. There are parts of rural America and parts of upstate New York where you will run into it, but it's not like people think, I don't think.
It's funny, you got me. I sketched a couple of questions before we started writing, and this conversation so far has me second guessing myself. I'm like, do I have private equity brain? Am I like thinking about this the whole wrong way? Because like we come at this, like obviously I'm attempting something similar to what you're attempting in a different part of the world, and we've come at it so differently. I think you did the very natural and human thing, which was you just moved there, and you bought an inexpensive house and you have a good job that you can sustain there, and you just like settling into it, and it's a lifestyle thing, and it's a whereas I'm like maybe too many years in the private sector has corrupted my brain, but I'm like, okay, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to join this organization and I'm going to work for them for 4 years. At year 4, I can expect a bonus of this amount. That bonus I can squirrel away into a nest egg. The nest egg is large enough to move the family to put down a down payment on a large house somewhere else. I can use that as a vantage point to build a local career in a city in this country that I want to move to while I scout out land that I can develop and blah, blah, blah. So I'm just thinking about this in just like a totally different way. I think it has its advantages in that if you could execute that plan, and I'm like fairly down the line on it now, and I think it's going well for what it is, you do actually arrive in a position of economic strength that would allow you to build things, right? So like potentially a library of your own or a church or whatever. But anyway, I wrote this question: do you think these towns are missing anything important that we actually have to build that you're thinking about building? But having had this conversation so far, I'm like very sympathetic to the fact that this is your life, right? This is where you live. You're part of a community. This isn't just like a development project that you need to be like mapping out ferociously every minute.
Yeah, no, it isn't. I mean, but I will say it depends on where you go, right? It's like I left my own hometown for a lot of reasons, and I could talk all day and night about that. But my town when I grew up had a store, it had a bar, it had a barber shop, it had 2 churches, it had things. There was regular public social life that existed. And then it all died. It all just went away. The older generation that kept those things alive, they died, and half their kids moved to Florida or whatever, and nothing is left. So if I were to live there, I would have things that I would have to build. And here's the thing, that I think anybody who's thinking about doing these kinds of things needs to remember is there are certain communities that are not going to be receptive to what you might want to do with them, right? For all I know, I could go back to my hometown, and I have a pretty strong feeling that this would be the case. If I bought the old bar and I turned it on and I said, okay, doors are open, we're doing this, they wouldn't want it because everybody's already habituated to something else. They've gotten on this many years with no bar in town. And if I said, hey, come on, everybody, they'd say, well, where were you? Who are you? Even though I grew up there, I haven't been there long enough. All this stuff, it gets granular in a way that is really hard to read if you're not from a place. And even if you're from a place, it can be difficult. I've been working in some capacity or another. I've been watching these markets and thinking about these kinds of things for almost 10 years in different ways, right? And I feel like I still got my training wheels on, So it's not that there's never a time for building. There is sometimes, but sometimes it's just a matter of hanging on to what you got. I don't need to build very much because my town's already got a grocery and a bar and a library and a church and a campground. And now I just got to work to hang on to those things and make sure that I don't see them shut down, right? And that does take money, and that does take a little bit of politicking and a little bit of savviness.
Does your wife like the place you live as much as you do? I mean, because clearly she's from somewhere else, whereas you knew what you were getting into. How's that transition been for her? And I ask not as a kind of like prying personal question, but just because like obviously this is something that the married guys like myself will have to think about as we make these radical transitions that we've talked ourselves into on the internet.
I mean, it helps that I'm a traditionalist, and she's from a family of traditionalist type people. Where if the husband says, "Hey, we're moving to Jakarta next week," then you're moving to Jakarta, and that's just the way it is. And so I think she's already been born, bred, and cookie fed to make her peace with whatever decision her husband might make, and thank God for it. But the other thing is that my mantle as her husband is to try to bring her to places and an iteration of life that would suit her and be good for her. And thus far, I think it's been a success. I think she's pretty happy just because we're near some Amish folks. The place is pretty. The house is nice, and she wants a good house. And that's half the battle, I think, for a woman a lot of times is you just need a really good house, right? If you got a really good house that is cheap enough that husband doesn't have to be running all over the earth trying to pay a $3,000 a month mortgage or what have you, right? Well, you've already come a step up from where most people are at, and she'll appreciate that. And then the other thing is she'll get to where she needs another woman to be friends with. So that's where you got to meet people who are in the local area. And we've done that. We've met plenty of people. We fill our house up sometimes with folks these are not Twitter people. These are not people from the internet. These are local folks who we've met and befriended, and they're good to us, and we try to be good to them, and that's a good thing, right? And so if you can add in a couple of souls you meet via the internet or what have you, it works out. So I think she's well brooked with this stuff anytime I've asked her, and I'm thankful for it.
Have you thought about trying to use your significant audience on the two platforms to like recruit, for lack of a better word, people to come and live near you?
Yeah, at this point, that's my core ambition with it. I'm just still trying to conceive of how best to do it because I don't want to tell people exactly where I live. I'm extremely reticent to do that for a lot of reasons. You get tens of thousands of people reading your stuff online. Odds are good that at least 2 or 3 of them are going to want to show up to your house and, do something weird. But more than that, I don't want developers to come in and swoop in and buy up properties that I could put in the hands of young families. I don't want them to come out from under me on that and turn them into condos or whatever. I don't know. I don't know what they're capable of, but most of it's not good. So those are my reservations. But totally, yeah, I want to start having get-togethers here, annual get-togethers, and I'm going to turn the lower floor of my back barn into a hostel. So all of my paying readers will be free to come and go as they wish and get a cheap bed on their way to wherever they're going, and we'll do get-togethers. And I think that alone is enough to attract the types of people who are already kind of waiting in the wings and watching and saying, maybe I ought to get up there. Maybe that would be right for me or whatever.
That was my experience. That's kind of how I'm thinking about it. So I want to do something similar, which is find some people in my audience to hopefully move into a small polity with a locality, a village or a town, and live near each other. And because of the shared values, we can build the kinds of network of relationships that we were discussing earlier. And I wasn't sure whether this was just a kind of like unrealistic fantasy or not until I actually started meeting some of my readers. So what some of my readers have done on their own initiative, because I make no secret of the fact I live in London, is whenever they're visiting London, they shoot me a DM and they're like, hey, I'm in London. Do you want to grab lunch or a coffee? It'd be great to meet you. And if I have any sense of who they are, I'll accept, if they're maybe a long-time commenter or a subscriber or whatever. And I've met quite a few of them now, and I've been blown away at how impressive they are. They are not internet weirdos. They're like incredibly impressive guys, really well put together, married, kids often. I've had a few guys who have been in seminary, for example, like exploring priestly formation, but just guys like, oh, okay, this is actually a viable route forwards. It's not, it's not like, it doesn't look like a 4chan meetup. It's these are well put together young men with families. So suddenly the project that I was conceiving of seems not just viable, but actually incredibly attractive. Like I'd love to live close to these people.
Yeah. No, it's true. I mean, meeting people on the internet. One, it's how I met my wife, right? But two, the people I've met have been some of the finest people I've ever met. And before I got on Twitter, which was maybe 3 years ago, I had pretty well resigned myself to living a reclusive life. I've been pretty alone through most of my life. I haven't really found the kinds of connections that I'd like to find. And the internet's been the best way to do it by far. So, and people are hungry for it. They're hungry for it. It's literally a case of if you build it, they will come. If you say, hey, here's a date and a place and a time, come. You don't have to have a big ticket charge. You don't have to rent a ballroom. No, you literally can have people tent camping and meeting in a pavilion with a crock pot full of chili and a few cases of beer, and they're good. And that's it, because people are so hungry to have meaningful conversations face to face. That's what everybody wants, and nobody can get it.
Okay, you've teed me up with mentioning how you met your wife to ask about the gas station girlfriend phenomenon. I know this is old news, but this is my one chance to speak with you. So I want to talk about gas station girlfriends. All right, for those unaware, like the thread, didn't the post get like 14 million views or something completely insane? But I wrote a little bit of it down just to orient those who don't remember it or didn't see it. Here's a quote from it. It was a long post, but here's a quote from it. Take a month or two between jobs and drive across the USA. Stop at every gas station and truck stop and eat every meal at diners during non-rush hours. Avoid cities. Stop primarily in poor rural areas out in the middle of nowhere. Every time you see a pretty cashier or waitress with a good vibe, politely ask her out. Tell her you're out seeing the country and looking for a place to settle and a good woman to marry. Repeat until you found someone to go steady with. Do you believe this? Do you know of anyone for whom this has worked?
100%.
Is my first question.
Yeah. Definitely. And even in the post, I think I mentioned there's a guy I know in Louisiana, and that's what he did. Stopped at a truck stop in Iowa and found a girl, thought she was pretty, and they're married with 3 children now, and she converted to Catholicism, and it's all good. And I know others who've done the same thing. And this used to be normal. This is what's crazy about that post, and kind of what it signifies is like, this is just like a wholesome lark of an adventure that a young guy who's quote unquote black pilled and just thinks he can't find a woman and has a million reasons in advance before he's even tried why he'll never get a woman, right? And a good woman to marry. He can just do it. Go ahead. What's it going to cost him? Probably very little. And if nothing else, he's gone out and he's seen the country and he's had some fun. I don't see what it could hurt, but it made everybody enraged. people lost their minds over it, right? So it's a very bad indicator. It's I don't know. People have. I wrote in my last article on my Substack, this is the great American gumption shortage. People used to have gumption. They used to have guts to just say, yeah, whatever, I'll try it. And they're not thinking about ways that failure could come. They just swashbuckle their way across. And these guys, they wind up having all kinds of opportunities simply because they had a penchant for risk and didn't cripple themselves with overthinking and worrying and all this other basically effeminate nonsense.
I guess some people, Charles Murray wrote a book called Coming Apart. It's been a while since I skimmed it, but the thesis is basically that America is in a very unhealthy way bifurcating into parts of society which are very functional, like where marriage rates are still relatively high, divorce rates are still relatively low, children grow up in two-parent homes, they're more prosperous, they're lower crime, and then areas where dysfunction is really setting in. And the sort of UK version of this is that the majority of children in the UK now grow up without both parents present in the home for at least a significant period of their childhood, which is like a pretty staggering. That's the majority of children, which is shocking. But I guess people have this vision of the kinds of people that are outside their positive bubbles, and they write them off as, well, I guess, if a girl's working in a gas station, that means she hasn't gone to college in a time when everyone's smart or capable gets the hell out of these places and tries to go to college. So she's probably dumb or on drugs or like obese or unattractive or, whatever it is, right in your contemporary paranoia here. Is that not the case? Are they wrong to like be concerned about that? And I ask you as someone that has spent probably more time traveling America than anyone else I know.
Yeah, they're wrong. I mean, here, even just think about it just in terms of raw statistics anyway, right? It's like if I'm single and I'm 25, okay, then what? I'm looking, let's say I'm a single white man who's 25 and I'm a Christian, okay? This is a fairly normal demographic in this country, okay? I'm looking for a woman who is anywhere from, let's say, 19 to, we'll even go a couple years older, 27, okay? Just that's already just a small segment of American females. But then the segment gets smaller if you say, well, yeah, I'm probably going to go with a white girl. No shame. I mean, people are this way. It's normal, right? Okay, I'm going to go with a white girl. Okay, I wanted to be a Christian, and I wanted to at least be open to my type of Christianity. Already you're talking about single digit percentages, low ones at that, right? So if as you go through small town South Dakota, you find, 50% of the women that you meet in that age range, they actually are obese, or they actually do smoke meth, or they actually are like low functioning. Okay, well, so what? Because you're only looking for one woman in one very already narrow demographic. And when you open your eyes to the actual way that the demography works, you're more likely, you have better odds in Iowa, in small town Iowa, than you do in Manhattan. You just do. Because even though there's a lot of people in Manhattan, there's a lot of women in Manhattan and a lot of pretty women in Manhattan, they're not probably the types of women you want to marry anyway. But the few that you meet up in Iowa, they're going to be the types of girls that, they just happen to be from there. And they're not from a family where you go to church or where you go to college, but they're from a family where you go to church, and they're just sitting there. And all the men have either drank themselves into prison or wandered off into the sunset to work in the oil fields, or the ones who are quality, they're already married. So what does a 25-year-old girl in that situation do? She might work at a gas station and just wait. And I have met many such women in my travels, and where it's obvious, and you can see, they're just waiting. They're just here. They're just waiting. It's as old as America itself, I think.
Yeah, I think just anything that gets you moving from one social situation to the next and interacting with people again and again, because there's no simple way to just make the relationship recession go away. Like there's a lot of factors that compound into it, and no one is more clear on that front than I am. On the other hand, a part of this is just the lack of intensity and frequency of social interaction. Like if you go back to the 1950s, which is the high point of American marriage rates and a number of other desirable things, it's not just that they were sort of traditional in some like vague sense, right? Like a kind of like maybe they were more religious or whatever. They were incredibly socially active people.
Right.
Famously, Robert Putnam has that book, Bowling Alone, which goes into just the intensity of the social engagement at that period. Like people were participating in, as the title implies, bowling leagues, but also civic organizations, churches, school boards, etc., etc. The list goes on. And they were just traversing social situations constantly. And even if you're not meeting women, you might be making friends with other men who can introduce you to a woman. And that just like that social fabric is just being woven tightly again and again and again. And it's funny, like how when you shift context, things come up. Like this was already well into when I was in a relationship. So I thought nothing of it at the time, except for like a funny story, but it sort of becomes relevant now, which is that, I was visiting Montana not that long ago, and I was waiting for someone. So I went and just grabbed a drink at a local bar by myself. And the barmaid was behind the bar, and she was very pretty, a little bit overweight. And I stood up to leave, and I was about to pay, and she said, "You don't have to pay for that." And it was like a very obvious, like,
Right.
hey, if you want to have a conversation, we can have a conversation. Very, 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 very nice from her, and I was very flattered. I insisted on paying, of course, or at least tipping her. But it was like, oh, okay, this is just a totally random interaction. But if I wanted this to be like an actual interaction of a romantic kind, that would be the doorway opening. And that was just one that opened itself. Like I wasn't trying to do anything, and it was opened by the fact that I was out of the house making, having this random interaction. And it was facilitated by the fact that when you're traveling in that way, it's not weird to be talking to strangers. Like if it's obvious you're not from somewhere, of course you're going to be talking to strangers because everyone's a stranger to you. It's not like a very self-conscious social situation where you're having to like cold open a woman or something. It's just like the kind of natural rhythm of life. So I have to say I'm sympathetic. I'm like my like cultural biases are battling in my head, my like instinct for like, yeah, just get out there and roll the dice.
Of course. Yeah, that's it. That's exactly it. And I think the negative response bespeaks like a wider problem, which is that if the social fabric of a civilization is unraveling, the social and the psychological are intimately connected, right? And so if that fabric's unraveling and you realize it, then no doubt your own psychological or intellectual ability to understand that unraveling is also falling apart, right? And so you're almost caught in this catch-22 where you can't identify the cause and effect of the circumstances around you. You know what I mean? And you begin to sort of like, you're not thinking clearly, so it's by realizing that the social fabric is coming apart doesn't mean you're in a position to understand the shape of it or how that or what that coming apart means or looks like. And it's a common trap. A lot of times people call me, when I talk like this online, people call me a boomer. They literally think that I'm a boomer. I'm 30 years old.
You have the voice of an old soul though. Like if I didn't know what you look like and like who you are, I would assume you're older than you are.
Well, yeah, I've heard that before. I think it's probably because I was raised by my grandparents, and most of my friends, the people I literally would have said, "Oh, that's my friend," they were in their 80s, their late 80s when I was a little boy, and they're all dead now. And I picked up their way of speaking and their way of thinking pretty seriously.
It's quite wonderful that I have cousins. My uncle is English, and he married a French woman, and they moved to France. And my cousins learned English only from their father, who speaks very perfect 1950s English.
Right.
So they completely unselfconsciously, when they're speaking English, which they speak perfectly, speak in this lovely 1950s English preserved accent. So it's very, very pleasant conversing with them. And it doesn't sound affected at all, which is what it normally does when you hear young people do that.
Right.
Anyway, Andy, it's been a real pleasure. We just hit the hour mark. I got all my questions out. and I've had a lot of fun. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Where can people find your work?
At shagbark.substack.com.
Thanks, Andy.
All right. Take care.
If you enjoyed this discussion, please go to becomingnoble.substack.com or click the link in the description, where you can find my best work, including over 100 essays, interviews with popular guests, and our chat, where you can talk with other excellent and like-minded people. That's becomingnoble.substack.com.